Our finances can quite often be a real source of anxiety and stress. At the moment, I'm experiencing for the first time paying for bills by standing order with my name at the top. It has previously been something that my parents dealt with or was included in my rent. I feel like I'm constantly checking to see whether we are under or over the allowance allowed each day. And quite often my mood can easily change dependent on whether it is over or under. This is just one example of how things of finance can have an impact on our daily living. I'm sure that you are able to think of financial things that you keep tabs on regularly in a similar way. When it comes to periods like the self-denial appeal, it can quite often feel like something we really would like to support. But then a worry about our own finances can either lessen our desire to help or stop us completely. Giving away money in periods like self-denial appeal or regularly as part of the biblical principle of tithing and offering can really challenge the world's view of finance, which, to quote the musical Cabaret, is along the lines of money makes the world go round. Having these worries is normal, yet we are still left with the challenge. Fortunately, our Bible reading for today, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 verses 1 to 15, speaks into this in a helpful way. This is Paul's second letter that we have to the church in Corinth, a major city with lots of different religious practices and major wealth. Paul spent 18 months there telling people about the death and resurrection of Jesus. People believed Paul and came from different religious and cultural backgrounds to form a united Christian community. Our passage for today speaks into a financial collection which was to go to support Christians in Jerusalem, where the church had fallen into poverty due to a famine. This might sound to us today like most charities that write to people for financial donations to support the work they do. However, Paul is writing about this as it is about more than the financial giving of the Corinthian church. Paul begins this section of the letter by telling about the generosity of other churches in supporting the Jerusalem church. The places Paul talks about are poor places where the expected money raised wouldn't be much. Yet they gave what they could to support others out of the love they had received from God. They did this eagerly and begged Paul for the opportunity. One commentator on this passage suggests that the Macedonian churches gave not more than they could afford, but gave more than what was expected of them. This, therefore, is an example of the generosity which goes beyond what is expected and can take people by surprise. Paul doesn't use this example to guilt trip the Corinthian church to start giving. They had already begun a collection which had been somewhat neglected, which we can see in verse 10. Yet Paul is using stories of generosity to inspire the same generosity from the church in Corinth. Paul is using the willingness and eagerness to show love through financial giving in this way to see whether there is a church that isn't exuding the love and generosity of God in the same capacity as others. The passage is using the relief collection for the Jerusalem church to speak into something much deeper than our financial contribution to collections. Paul is wanting to focus on the generosity of believers. Paul, when referring to the Macedonian churches, highlights the first act of generosity was to give themselves to God fully and freely in verse 5. The foundation of all this is our submission to God and our surrendering our desires for God's desires. From this, we have a joy that leads to overflowing generosity, found in verse 2, and a transformation that allows us to love with a purer love and to live life in the fullest. With this in mind, Paul's mentioning of the collection is an evidence to see who has been or not been transformed by God and were living or not living in complete submission to him. It is important to note here that we do not achieve salvation like a wage packet or by ticking off a full to-do list. Giving in the collection with generosity alone wouldn't have brought a church into a place of right standing before God. Our salvation is by God's grace alone, working through our faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We do not earn it. It is something we receive from God as a gift. The change in behaviour is only evidence of the inward change that God brings about when we give our lives over to him, and not a work to earn his favour. Paul kind of highlights this in his second example of generosity in this section, the generosity of Jesus, in verse 9. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we have received an amazing gift that we do not deserve and cannot earn. Life to the full, seen in John chapter 10, verse 10, for eternity. This is a radical act of generosity. Jesus died and rose again to offer us life, even while we were enemies of God, seen in another letter by Paul, Romans chapter 5, verse 10. By the grace of God, we were given a richness in life that goes beyond anything we can achieve in our own strength. This is an act of generosity I will constantly be in awe at, and it works as an example of how we should be as people of faith in the resurrection and life of Jesus. As I mentioned earlier, the Corinthian church had already begun this collection, but for whatever reason, it had fallen by the wayside. They had been inspired by God and his generosity to act, but they began, but hadn't by this point completed the act or the task at hand. They were prompted to engage in this act of unity across the church, but other things got in the way. As this is something Paul didn't command them to do, seen in verse 8, this is something they engaged with out of inspiration rather than obedience to another human's vision. I wonder if we are the same in our lives. We believe that when we come to faith in the resurrection of Jesus and give our lives to God, that we are given the Holy Spirit, part of the Godhead, to live with and within us. The Spirit prompts us, guides us, transforms us, convicts us, and leads us forward in our lives if we choose to follow its leading. Therefore, the Holy Spirit is in the habit of prompting people to do things. Our Bible passage shows us how the Spirit prompted people to engage in this collection for the church in Jerusalem. In your life, have there been times where you have had a prompting or an idea of something you could do to show true and genuine love, care, and value to another person, to self, to creation, and to the church? A tragedy in the life of faith is when these ideas or promptings remain just as that, an idea or a prompting. Imagine you have received the prompting to do a small or radical act of kindness to someone to show love and value to them. If you leave that prompting as only a prompting and don't act on it, that person has missed out on an opportunity to know that they are loved, cared for, and valued. For me, in this moment, This passage challenges me about how obedient I am to the leading of the Holy Spirit in my day-to-day living. We can resist the Spirit's leading, and it can quite often be difficult to live in a place of radical generosity. Yet, we have the example of Jesus we can look to and find strength from to help us. Through the Spirit's presence, we are given the same strength that Jesus has to live his life of radical generosity. The thing about grace, that all of this is that we have received it freely. And as we act from a place of generosity rooted in God's grace that we don't deserve, we find that it multiplies and never runs dry. In this place, we don't have to have the anxiety and stress that I mentioned at the beginning about finances, because God's grace is a well that is overflowing and never runs dry, no matter how much we use it and give it out. The Spirit's prompting is something that we all experience. I have no doubts about that at all. We might not be aware that it is the Holy Spirit prompting us into activity to show love, but none of us have the excuse that we do not receive promptings to show love to others. We just have to question whether we are prepared to leave these promptings as ideas in our minds or to act upon them. This week, what can you do to make sure that when the Holy Spirit prompts you to action to show love, care and value to people from a place of generosity, you act on the idea?